Well, good evening and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I saw a post recently from a buddy of mine who I really quite respect and think he's an incredible recording artist as well as a nice guy, about his alcoholism, and that he had just passed an important milestone of being sober for 5 years. And it was really quite a involved and personal post that he made. And so I thought it would make a good show to understand his journey and the addiction and what got him into it, what got him out of it, and how he's faring. So let me introduce you to recording artist, incredible guitarist, a nice guy. He's played with Platinum Blonde. He's played with, I think, almost every single person I know of in Canadian rock music. And he's a really nice guy, Rob Laidlaw. Hey, Rob, how you doing?
I'm doing exceptionally well, Brian, and thank you for having me on your show.
So who are some of the people you played with? Because I forget all the different names of people you played with.
Yeah, well, you mentioned Platinum Blonde, and that was actually, it's worth noting because as you had mentioned, on Saturday I passed my I did pass my milestone, as you had said, 5th year sober, and it was 5 years ago. On July 11th that I had my last, thank God, alcohol-related seizure. And I was at the time playing with the band Platinum Blonde. And I had over the course of, I think it was about 4 years, I had 3 grand mal seizures based on, ironically, alcohol withdrawal, because of the blood sugar. My system was so accustomed to alcohol coursing through its veins that fundamentally, if there was an absence of that in any given day, my body would struggle, and it would crave that sugar boost, and if it didn't receive it, it was subjected to extreme physiological responses and leading to the seizures. And they're not uncommon. It's just they certainly became my default position over the course of those 4 years. And the moment you have a seizure, you're stripped of a lot of things, like some very basic dignity. So over that 4-year period, I didn't drive, which was pretty bizarre circumstance to find myself in at the age of, so I'm 55 now, and that was, I was 49 turning 50, and that was my last seizure. And, but leading up to that last seizure, I hadn't driven for, since my mid 40s. So,
right.
Anyway, I was working with Platinum Blonde. You'd asked a couple other bands. Over the years I've worked with, as you had mentioned, probably touched down with every major Canadian recording artist, Kim Mitchell, Alana Miles, Honeymoon Suite, Rough Trade, Tom Cochrane, Alanis Morissette, a band called Helix, Long John Baldry, like just literally at a certain point.
And you're typically a bass player, but you also play lead guitar?
That's right, yep. So I started off on lead guitar, on 6-string guitar, but in my sort of late teens, found myself in a position where I was playing the bass guitar, and within 6 months I was flooded with offers to play the bass. I was also a young father, and at which point I made the decision to, if I was going to continue to follow my God-given talents, universe-given talents, and exploit them, I would have to sort of take a different road. Now, sadly, by my late teens, early 20s, I was already very highly functioning alcoholic, and I'll just give you a wee bit of prehistory. My father...
Well, let's wait a second, and let's do that in just a second. We're chatting tonight with Rob Laidlaw, who's an incredible rocker, performer, bass guitarist, lead guitarist, songwriter, producer, etc. He's going to tell us about his history with alcoholism and how he got through it. But first of all, we're going to take a break and come right back in just a minute. So stay with us.
And
well, welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting tonight with Robert Laidlaw. He's a bass guitarist, a songwriter, performer, lead guitarist, producer, music producer. He's performed with Platinum Blonde and a whole slew of other Canadian bands. And I guess, Rob, when you were in your late teens, early 20s, you became an alcoholic. Is that correct?
Yes, and it started a little earlier than that, but just a wee bit of prehistory. My father was an alcoholic as well, and sadly and tragically, that is what in the end took his life. And he was a high-functioning alcoholic, so you live what you learn. And yeah, he had which is not uncommon with well, doctors specifically, and I learned this through growing up with my father, who he was a psychiatrist, and he had obviously psychiatrist friends, but he also had general practitioner friends too, and they seemed to certainly back then, this was the late 70s, early 80s, seemed to lean towards handing out scripts pretty liberally. And subsequently, he had suffered an addiction to Valium early in his career, and which where there's a huge problem with addictive pills today. But back then, doctors were notorious for self-prescribing, and then coupled with the fact that he chose to, which is, it kills millions of people a year, alcoholism, and he chose to sort of deal with his. He was clinically depressed as well, so he and kind of undiagnosed. He chose to deal with it by drinking.
Even though he was a psychiatrist, he was clinically depressed, undiagnosed, taking Valium and drinking
alcohol. Yeah, correct. The irony is that he helped hundreds of people and by association thousands of people. His patients literally loved him, and they were completely unaware of the trauma and drama that was going on inside his head, which sadly, as I've come to identify in my recovery, most of us are sort of staring into the dark emotionally most of the time. And I mean, my God, look at the predicament we find ourselves in today, right? I mean, this entire pandemic. But I mean, I think, the larger question is that we literally have an epidemic and have had an epidemic of mental unwellness for decades, right?
Yep.
So he actually helped people with that very dilemma in life. I often thought that must have been a pretty intense burden for him to shoulder.
No question.
And as I said, he had patients that literally loved him more than their own families and whatnot.
Now, why do you raise your father? Do you think addiction is genetic, or were you socialized into the addiction?
No, I you know what? I mean, I'm quite an active member in AA, and I mean, in the last couple of decades, it's been diagnosed as a disease like Parkinson's, like depression, and there is a genetic component to it for sure. It's a family disease. There's certain cliches and slogans that are bandied around in AA that quite simply ring true, as far as I can tell. And one of the things, the two fellows that composed the big book back in the late 30s, Bill and Bob, one of them was a doctor, incidentally. And the anonymous came about because of the fact that back then in the late 30s, had you admitted that you had a problem with alcohol or were an alcoholic, you could risk losing everything. So that was kind of, because what I'm about to talk about is lying and deception, because that is really nested in addiction for sure. And it's the deception, self-deception first and foremost, but it's also the lies that the people closest to you kind of either very overtly or subtly infer that they have to lie for you. And at a very young age, I started lying for my father. I've come to that realization, and it was just again something that, as a very young person, sort of my formative years, I learned to, I mean, if he was exposed for being hungover, going into work, being completely drunk on the weekends, things could have been, they could have had dire consequences. So
So you
by the
covered
time
for him.
sorry?
You covered for him.
Precisely, and conversely, so did my children to a degree, because not only am I in AA, I am in ACA, which is Alcoholic Children, Adult Children of Alcoholics, and I've found that very helpful as well, just in terms of my recovery. So and I also go to therapy. So my recovery is kind of a smorgasbord of just self-analysis.
But if you got into this in your late teens, early 20s, and it wasn't until your late 40s that you sort of had your come to whatever moment.
But the first seizure, you're right.
You had the 20, 25 years of alcoholism.
That's right. And severe, psychophysiological abuse, really. And during that period, I raised a family, and again, sadly, quite dysfunctionally at the end of the day. But from the outside looking in, one would say, my daughter's a 30-year-old lawyer. My son works in the 28-year-old, works in the field of autism, helping people with, and they went to Queen's University and we had a house. I mean, superficially, I was a high-functioning, not unlike my father, high-functioning alcoholic. So that's almost the most dangerous kind, because we see the most obvious examples of, say, a homeless person. Now, they're generally alloyed to alcoholism and or drug addiction, but there's often a mental illness involved there too, right? Like whether it's schizophrenia or bipolar, and all of those terms have changed over the last few decades as well. But fundamentally, alcohol is sort of the most accepted drug in our culture. I mean, look at the fact that we call it social drinking. Look at the fact, people having one too many we give them a pass most of the time, and our behavior that we exhibit when we're completely intoxicated is often given a pass as well, right? So I sadly chose a career that not only encouraged it, but it accepted it, and it
sometimes glorified it. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Precisely. And Brian, what comes at the end of that trilogy of the moniker of the music industry? The talent. That's the bottom of that's the bottom of that hierarchy is rock and roll, or being able to stand up on a stage and perform. And believe me, I know people that know and have interacted with some of the biggest, most iconic artists in the world. And I'm going to use the band the Rolling Stones as an example. Keith Richards is someone that is literally, it's just dumb luck that the man's still on this planet, because he has systematically, for the majority of his adult life, abused his physiology. Anyway, back to what happened with me. So I'm in this industry that condoned it. Some of the real truths of my existence was that, watching my father degenerate, and having said this, he was still, he was such a good fella. He was just a tragic fella. And there was a great connection I had with that as I grew, and then as a young father, and grew into what it was I was doing, and the fact that so often people just look the other way when and then I would have people lie for me, and most often my family, right? If I was hungover and I'd get a call and I wasn't able to make it to the studio or whatever, I would have them cover for me, and that happened with my father when I was growing up all the time. So the truth is, deception and avoidance is a key component of addiction.
Now, if someone had come to you in your 30s and said, Rob, you're an alcoholic, you got to go to rehab or something like that, what would your reaction been at the time? Denial?
It would have been denial. It would have been, you know, what are you talking about? And Brian, I mean, for all intents and purpose, I was functioning at an extremely high level in the industry. We named those artists. I was touring and performing all over the world with those artists, right? The sort of secret reality was that after every show, and there were times where literally I was grinding through my performance. My only responsibility when I was on the road was a 70 to 90 minute chunk of time where I would have to perform, you know, with whomever I was supporting, whether it be Kim or Alana or whoever, Platinum Blonde, and deliver their music in a professional and also essentially we're actors. We get up on stage and we put on this persona, this larger than life, and we create this image. And I can honestly tell you that that was never something that I felt entirely comfortable with. Ironically, I never felt comfortable with thousands of people looking at me. So therefore, I would medicate. We called that medicating ourselves. And I can, with all assuredness, and I'm not going to name any names, say that most all of us would have at least a few adult beverages before we went on stage, and or something that would level you out if you'd had one too many adult beverages before you went on stage. And that generally was cocaine, which again is a toxic mix of you know, straightening you up, as it were. And
so it wasn't just alcohol, it was drugs as well.
At the end of the day, sex and drugs, I mean, starting with drugs, I mean, the sex is sort of what occurs when the drugs and the alcohol have commingled to the point where you're aware of your bad behavior, you just don't care about the consequences. And that's sort of, again, that's alloyed to the deception and denial and avoidance of, you know, just lying to yourself and then subsequently lying to everyone else around you. And it's a very dark path to follow, right? And to
and what were the implications of this? You've talked about the seizures.
Okay, so
health problems as well.
That was what in my post that you had mentioned, and you had commented on it. Was the moment where I literally couldn't look the other way. And what it was I'd had 3 seizures leading, and my second seizure, actually, the singer from Platinum Blonde, Mark, held me through it. It was right, you know, an hour before walking on stage in front of 20,000 people. And you know, even still and yet, so, you know, it was a big festival. So the EMS were there, and they you know, had my seizure. They had to rush me to the hospital. The only way I got out of having an EEG done, which is mandatory when you have a seizure, was that I literally said to the attending doctor, I said, look, see that person on the front page of the entertainment section? That's me. And if I don't get back to this show, the show won't go on. He said, okay, all right. You know, because I said, I know what this is caused by. It's not a brain issue. It's not. And so he let me go. I proceeded to go back to the stage, walk on stage, down a goblet of wine, and do, they call it a bump of cocaine, to get back on stage and perform. And so that's, you know, that's just the spiral that addiction was. 5 years ago, I was at my mother's memorial, about to deliver a eulogy for her, and I stood up, and for the first time in front of my family, and some family members I hadn't seen in years, I proceeded to bail through the chairs and flop around like a fish. And found myself back in Toronto General, and the doctor was looking at the chart, and at this point I was 49 years old, and he looked at the chart and he looked at me and said, Rob, you've been drinking a lot. And I said, well, no, you know, not so much. You've probably been doing drugs as well. And I said, absolutely not. He said, okay, well, you know, you're not going to live into your 50s. Have a great day. And threw the chart down on on the gurney and walked away. And at that point, my daughter was there, my son was there, my ex-wife was there, my sister, who lives abroad and is my soulmate in my life, I don't see her often, was there. And a few of them started to cry, and my son just shook his head and said, Dad, what the F are you doing? And that was the last drink I had. That was on a Saturday. On Monday, as I put in my post, I couldn't look the other way. So psychophysiologically, it was almost like PTSD, right? I mean, it wasn't necessarily the things that I had seen in my life of debaucherous. It's the things I had done. And I couldn't contend with that. And the physiology and the psychology were clearly saying to me, yeah, Rob, this show is over if you don't make a change. So that
But
was,
it's interesting.
that was
It wasn't the seizure. It wasn't what the doctor said. Sounds to me like it was what your son said that gave your head a shake.
well, it was a combo platter of those things. But no, when I realized that the hole was firmly dug in the ground, and I'd just been doing a little jig around it for the last few years, and that if things weren't going to change, not only was I going to lose everything that was meaningful to me, my familial relationships, I was going to lose my career. I was, because my very first seizure, it was just dumb luck that I didn't end it, because I fell, and when you fall and you seize, again, dumb luck that I didn't have a seizure standing on a stage 40 feet off the ground in front of 20,000 people. I could have broken my neck and died. First seizure I had, though, I did fall on my wrist and invert my wrist. And had I not had a very talented hand doctor at the Toronto Western, he set my wrist in a position that had my hand placed like this, which is where it is on a guitar neck. And so when I came out of a 2-month cast operation, the very first thing I did, he had set it so I could play. But anyway, back to that. I literally on the Monday after the Saturday, having my third and final seizure, I booked myself into rehab for 3 weeks and proceeded to white knuckle through abstinence, no drinking. And I was a smoker though too, as well. So I was smoking a pack of cigarettes a day, which I eventually quit 6 months into my sobriety. But again, today, where I sit today, I've been exercising for the last 2 years. I've been going back to things that were always virtuous to me in terms of reading and learning and growing, and exercising the gray matter, because I'm telling you, if it didn't need this body to walk around, it would have killed it years ago. So
We're chatting with Rob Laidlaw, a musical performer who was addicted to sex, drugs, rock and roll, alcohol, and cigarettes, and got himself into rehab and cleaned up. We're going to come back in just a minute and hear about that cleanup process. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting tonight with Rob Laidlaw, musical performer, played with Platinum Blonde and a whole slew of other bands. He's a incredible songwriter. He's a music producer. He's a bass guitarist, but I've also seen him play lead guitar on numerous occasions, and he's excellent at that. Probably one of the best performances I saw was a medley of, was it 80 songs that you did? That was just spectacular, Rob.
Yeah, that was a medley of how many hit songs that have affected us in the most impactful way can be recited over 4 basic chords, right? And that's what's kind of interesting about music too. I mean, we're all fundamentally talented in life, right? And I mean, not all of us either have the courage or the opportunity to follow our muse. And with music specifically, there's only 7 major minor chords. There's sharps and flats, but there's A, B, C, D, E, F, G, right? We don't go any higher than G. There's no H chord, there's no Z chord. So once you, from a mechanics perspective, learn the chords and chord progressions, you can learn to play all of the songs that have impact. And music truly is really the universal language. I mean, it's something that transcends age, race, continents, and yeah. I mean, it helps soothe our anxieties. It makes the great moments glorious, and the really hard and depressing moments more bearable, I've found, right? So
well, it's a great medley, and so I hope I get to hear you perform it again soon.
Absolutely.
So let me ask you, you checked yourself into rehab. Some people think that rehab is something that's going to embarrass them, and they don't want it to be ever known that they were going to rehab. How did you get over that?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, like I said earlier, I was at the point where if things didn't change, I was going to risk losing all aspects of the infrastructure that was me, Rob Laidlaw, as a
And you had
professional.
denied it for 25, 30 years.
30 years.
But obviously your kids knew it, and your son confronted you on the hospital bed.
That's right. And I mean, I had a few. Well, actually, I really didn't have any choices. I lied long enough, lied to myself, lied to everyone around me, and now it was literally for me, do or die. But you're right, absolutely. There was a great deal of shame and humiliation, right? And I didn't. Okay, here was the biggest hurdle. I could not conceive of my life going forward without alcohol in it. Alcohol had always been aligned with a party, loosening up. I mean, one of my favorite all-time lines that a fellow that I toured with for a few years, and who had impacted my early life, was Kim Mitchell. He had a band called Max Webster, and there was a line in one of his songs called "The Party," and it was, "We're just musicians here to thin the thickness of your skin," and that's really what music has done. And the concept of partying has often been associated with alcohol. Like literally, it's the social lubricant, right? So couldn't conceive of my life without it, and I was mortally afraid that not only would I not be able to perform, because I literally identified that my entire life as a songwriter, which has been a huge component of my professional life, over the years, everyone I ever performed with, they would always be making a record after the tour I was on, and invariably I'd throw my hat in the circle and say, well, hey, I'm a songwriter too. And I would always be allowed or afforded the opportunity to write with them. And sometimes there were great results. I ended up being a Juno nominated Songwriter of the Year. And I co-wrote a bunch of top 10 singles with different artists. But bottom line is, I identified that I had literally been intoxicated 98% of my life. And a number of really sort of scary realizations were, I hadn't really had any kind of sexual relationship when I hadn't been drunk. I hadn't had any kind of writing relationship when I was songwriting, when I was performing. All of these things were alloyed to alcohol. So the notion of me going into rehab and just completely, self-dividing, subdividing myself from that crutch, that sort of coping mechanism, maladaptive as it may be, it was still my coping mechanism, and that was probably the biggest fear. The fact that
how'd you get over that?
Everyone in my world was prepared to walk away. So the specter of absolute isolation. And here's the other thing, Brian, too. I remember that summer, the June before the July incident, I was in Vancouver with Platinum Blonde in a packed hotel room after the show, partying, and I had this very, very dark epiphany. And it was, I was drinking the last drink of my night, completely hammered, and realizing I didn't need it. And in that moment, I didn't care if a thought came to me, our neurotic minds, that I didn't really care if I lived or died in that moment. I thought, Jesus, what an absolutely nihilistic thought to pop into your head, when all my life I've worked for this perspective, professional accolades, professional acceptance, performing in front of thousands of people, making great money. And that's the thought that popped into my head at the end of the evening. And I realized I was completely isolated in my own addiction, in a chasm of total and complete despair.
But it sounds like a lot of the people maybe in the industry, or maybe it was your family as well, for a long period of time, and you with your father were enablers. That because
100%.
And it's interesting that you say that your son called you on it, and then you felt like if you didn't take action, you would have been isolated. Does it take sort of the threat of isolation for someone to come to that realization?
It literally robs you of pretty much everything in the end. And then when you also start feeling physically depleted all the time because of it, and that's essentially, you know, everyone talks about, oh, I'm never, you know, the hangover anecdote is, you know, I'm never going to do that again. Oh God, you know, as they're vomiting into a toilet, right? And, you know, I mean, essentially, we're allergic to alcohol. That's what makes us sick, is the fact that we've literally consumed too much of it, and we have an allergy to alcohol. And so when, you know, on every you know, every direction you look, it's just the worst possible scenario. You're not happy drinking anymore. You're not happy in your career. Your personal relationships are literally blowing up around you. As I said in my post, I couldn't look the other way, and the shit had hit the fan in that moment in the hospital. And so I thought, you know what? I got to at least give this a shot. And the first while, I'd say the first 6 months, you know, I was in group therapy. I was in personal therapy. The personal therapist suggested I find an AA group. So, I mean, in AA, they suggest when you're new, when you come in, because it's the terms that they use in Alcoholics Anonymous is you come in, you stop drinking, and when you go back out, you've relapsed. So when I came in, I did 90 meetings in 90 days. And that's an awful lot of recovery when you've literally lived a life of absolute, you know, deception and denial.
Why is it so important to be in that group for 90 days?
It's literally the prescribed antidote for the struggling alcoholic. The person.
But you need to have the support from other people. You can't do it on your own. You need that support from the group.
100%.
Even though it's a group of people you don't really know. It's not friends, it's not family. It's people that are anonymous that you don't really know.
They are, but you know, the thing that's profound about it is that it truly is a fellowship. And my son and I, actually the picture that I posted on my 5th sober anniversary or birthday was Spencer and I in Florida in January. And when for the first time, so I've been taking Spencer for the last few years on different trips as sort of a bonding son and dad thing. But for the first time, we were down in West Palm, and I thought, you know, the first day we were there, I thought, you know what, I'm going to Google some meetings because I've never done it when I've been away. And, you know, sure enough, I mean, I Googled AA meetings, and they just, you know, popped up in abundance. And I thought, F it, I'm doing this. So I just told Spence, I said, buddy, I'll be back in a couple hours. Found this group, and I walked into this room of absolute strangers in West Palm Beach, and there was a big group. It was about 60 people. Immediately felt my any anxiety or insecurity just fade right away. They immediately welcomed me. Drank the really bad coffee, which is
typical.
Yeah, intrinsic of AA meetings, and or intrinsically linked to, and sat down and you know, sort of you go around the room, you go, hi, my name's Rob, and I'm an alcoholic. And at that specific moment, I said, I'm down here on holiday from Toronto, Canada. And immediately a few, you know, fellow Canucks, you know, gave me a greeting. I'm from here and there and from Canada. And it truly is the fellowship. I mean, it doesn't matter where you are. And there was an old timer, because I ended up going back 4 times in that week, because it was a very impactful meeting for me, and it was profound. And I think it was the 3rd meeting I went to. This old timer said the thing that really strikes him about AA, and when I say old timer, he's been sober for 30 years, which is a hell of a lot of sobriety. And he said, it's the fact that we're all striving, you know, because we're acuity-based animals. We aim at things in life. And I know, Brian, you've been involved for years in the sports world. We shoot to get goals. We aim at to achieve things, strive for things. And he said, in AA, we're striving to make ourselves better and be better. And with that aim, like dropping a pebble in a pond, the centrifugal rings that go out, you literally, everyone that you interact with, they and I've seen it because I'm living it right now. You actually influence, and the people that influence you, that what comes back is a more positive perspective. Because I mean, quite simply, the reality is that,
You can't do it on your own.
fundamentally, huh?
You can't do
Yeah,
it on your own. You need those.
I
You
couldn't
need
do it
that
on my
fellowship.
own. Yeah. And that's really what it boiled down to, was even to this day, it's a very meaningful part of my my
Tell me about.
weekly routine.
Tell me about rehab. You went cold turkey. You went
I
straight.
did. So I went.
Was
I
that
went to this place in. I live out in Durham region, and there's a very well regarded and highly recognized rehab center out here. And I went there, and I lived there for 3 weeks. I literally moved into a room with a stranger, went to group counseling once in the morning, once in the afternoon, did an AA meeting there as well, once a day. So I literally dove headfirst, because anything that was remotely related to my life prior to that had to be stripped. I literally had to go cold turkey. Because I had tried after my first seizure, Brian. I mean, you have a seizure, and it's not like a little episode. It's grand mal, right? Like it's your body literally freaking out. And again, I hurt my hand. So at that point, I went to a few AA meetings, and I even remember going to them, kind of hungover, and I made an attempt to
do it on your own?
to do it on my own, and it clearly didn't work. And so anyway, I was grinding through the first 3 weeks, and then when I came out, I removed myself from the industry for about almost a year, as a matter of fact, because everything that was remotely related to how I lived my life was a trigger.
Do you think that there were gigs or performers or associations that didn't want you because you were an alcoholic and you'd gone to rehab?
Okay, now here's the tragedy. Being a high functioning alcoholic, the first real job that I accepted in sobriety was, interestingly, a band called Toronto, and the musical director for the band called me, and he said, "Rob, I understand," because Platinum Blonde, at the point in time where I had my last seizure, the singer had fired me. He literally said, "Yeah, I'm not going to get on stage with you the way I'd become." So again, like I had said, I was losing credibility. Things had become so dire. Anyway, at this point, I'd had almost a year of sobriety, and so I accepted the job. It wasn't a huge time commitment in terms of being on the road and having those triggers. It was literally the very first professional gig that I took was a 3-day weekend out west with this band. But the first show we did was a multi-billed festival with 12 bands, 10 of which I'd played with. And, so we had Kim Mitchell, Rick Emmett from Triumph, Honeymoon Suite, Platinum Blonde, Sass Jordan, Helix, as I say, 10 of the 12 acts that were on, 6 acts each day, I had performed with. And we were all it was in Kelowna, BC, and we were all staying at this beautiful hotel. And one of the things you do in AA is as you're going through the steps, the 12 steps, the 4th step is you make a assessment of the things that you've done wrong, your character defects. And then the 8th step is you actually go out into the world and you make amends. You tell the people that you had wronged how deeply sorry you were for that behavior. So I took it upon myself at that point in the day, because there were at least 10 bosses, as it were. So Kim Mitchell and Rick Emmett, that I could, it was like shooting fish in an amends barrel in a specific instance. And we were there was the first evening, we were all congregated, ironically, in the bar of the hotel, because the promoter was throwing a big shindig for all the artists. And I systematically sat down with Kim, and I said, "Look, I just want a couple of minutes of your time, Kim. I wanted to deeply apologize for," and he goes, "Oh, Rob, I knew you liked to drink, but I never really, didn't really affect your playing all that much." And then I didn't bring his, his attention to 2 or 3 occasions where I'd lost my voice because I had, one of the things that alcohol's notorious for is obliterating your voice, drawing it out and everything else. Terrible for singers specifically. And then, Rick Emmett, same thing. I sat down with Rick and I said, again, I'm sorry for, and you know what, I recalled sort of in the mid 2000s, the early 2000s, 2004 or 5, being on stage with Rick doing this huge festival show. And he spontaneously said, Rob Laidlaw on bass guitar, and I launched into a solo, and it was all improvised. And after the concert, after the show, he said, Rob, that was great playing. And I truly didn't really recall because I'd been that sort of drunk. And so anyway, I apologized to Rick. And Rick, again, so being a high-functioning alcoholic is probably the worst kind to be, because you literally get to the point where I was never a falling down drunk.
Right.
Drinker. And but anyway, in that specific instance, it was quite telling to me that I had a problem that was never going to get better, that I had been able to overcome the effects of it and still do the job I was hired to do, yet it was physiologically wiping me out.
Wiping you out.
Wiping me out.
We're chatting with Rob Laidlaw, a performer that has just celebrated his 5th year of sobriety. We're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments. Stay with us.
Hi, I'm Rob Laidlaw.
Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting with Rob Laidlaw, incredible performer who's really been very frank and open about his alcoholism and his march towards sobriety. And just last week, he celebrated 5 years sober. Rob, let me change tack just for a second, if I could, and ask you, if you knew someone, your son or someone that was going through similar problems, and you know that they were addicted to drugs or alcohol or whatever, what would you tell them?
Well, I mean, interestingly, in this pandemic where we find ourselves, and we find ourselves in this sort of very curious format here, I liken it to the Hollywood squares of meetings. People are really struggling, and there's been a great deal of relapse. There's been a great deal of additional drinking. I mean, the interesting thing about essential service that through all of this was liquor stores.
Yeah.
So that's just sort of a clear indication of how not only addicted but dependent we are on alcohol to soothe whatever anxieties and issues that mental unwellness, as I said earlier, we contend with. So I've been approached by a number of people to, in AA, it's called sponsor them. And essentially I have a sponsor too. But what I would tell them first and foremost is I'd essentially detail my story, which I've, in the last year, up until the last 5 months, the last year I've been asked to speak at different rehab centers around the GTA because of the fact my story is, I mean, we all have unique stories. I mean, don't get me wrong, we're all uniquely unrepeatable, each and every one of us. My story, okay, the thing I found when I first came in was that there weren't more musicians and actors and creative people in the rooms. I expected to see, just a litany of musicians and actors and who people in the arts littering these rooms, and there wasn't. So the fact that I've continued to maintain my sobriety has been a story that has resonated with people. But first and foremost, if someone came to me, I would sort of have very basic conversation, how deeply they're dependent on alcohol and or drugs to escape reality, because right now reality is pretty harsh.
If you knew someone was very dependent on either alcohol or drugs, but like you denied it.
That's right. I would.
What would you do? How would you confront them?
Well, I wouldn't confront them, because I mean, that's probably, like you had said earlier, like, why didn't you grab the bull by the horns those many years ago that you had your first seizure? And the answer to that was, I really didn't think, I wasn't a falling down drunk living on the streets. I was a high functioning drunk that literally had had a very successful career, done all of the benchmark things that people do in their adult life, which is, have a meaningful relationship, raise children, buy houses, send them off to school. All of those things were done, all the while percolating through addiction and alcoholism, or addiction with alcohol. And but I would literally encourage them to ask themselves some very basic and sadly some very hard questions, and that is, if you were to remove alcohol, let's stick with alcohol, drugs are a slightly different situation, would you be able to function? Could you make it through a day without sedating yourself, like escaping, which is what it was for me at the end of the day, escaping reality? And if the answer to that was no, then I would encourage them to, and I've done this as a matter of fact, I've directed at least half a dozen people that have come to me and go, Rob, I think I'm drinking problematically. And I go, well, come on to my meeting. And you can come, as Brian, you've done these Zoom meetings a lot. You can come on to the meetings anonymously. You literally can just sit in on these meetings. You don't have to physically go to a church basement or wherever and show up and sit there.
Someone told me that it's important, though, to be able to admit to yourself and people publicly that you're a drug addict or that you're an alcoholic. You actually have to say those words. Is that true?
Yeah, first and foremost, you have to acknowledge it to yourself. And that at the point that people have been coming to me, because it has been happening frequently in the last 5 months, they're aware that things have become so dependent. Certain aspects of their life have become so unmanageable. And that's the first step of AA. You've come to the conclusion or the realization that your life has become unmanageable due to your abuse of alcohol and or other substances. And
Can people do it on their own, or do they need AA or rehab?
I sure as heck couldn't. And I'm a pretty strong-willed person, and it had been it had been so many years of denial and so many years of this was the way I functioned in life, and the fear of not drinking was so great that I just continued to drink year after year after year.
And that doctor took a fairly hard line with you.
He 100%. I mean, he essentially called me on my BS. He literally said, "Okay, you've had 3 seizures. They've all been the same issue. The circumstances surrounding them have been the same. It was alcohol withdrawal, meaning the blood sugar had dipped so low that your body literally was craving it and then didn't know what to do. So the synapses started freaking out."
Is it important to have someone call you on your BS?
That's essentially what the people that are reaching out to me, I've identified that they've literally come to the conclusion that they can't lie to themselves anymore, and that people around them are starting to scatter. And in this very curious time, this imposed self-isolation, this whatever, the quarantine, however you want to frame it, is very unnatural, right? And so I've seen a huge increase. I've seen a huge increase of people that have relapsed in AA, people that I would never have assumed would have, but due to the anxiety and the stress. I mean, life is harsh and unfair, Brian. You know this. It's the reality.
Life is harsh and unfair, no question. Well, Rob, I really appreciate you chatting with us tonight about your addiction and about your sobriety. And congratulations on 5 years sober.
Thanks, my friend. I'm hoping for 5 more.
I look forward to watching you play pretty soon. Let me know when you're playing.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Brian.
That's Rob Laidlaw on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, chatting about his addiction to alcohol and his 5 years of sobriety and how he got there. Thanks so much. Good night, everybody.